People are unspokenly obligated to have positive opinions of their lives. So if people had, first off, an ability to actually evaluate, to actually write a product review of their lives, I think you would have a lot more honesty. We sort of mandate that people feel better and get better and adjust and make do. And that's, in my opinion, an insane
I
expectation.
think you would have less suicide by having that option open, because now a lot of the suicide comes from the pressure of believing that life is not supposed to be suffering. And I think that when you hold a different perspective, you have this feeling of, how you hit rock bottom and all of a sudden you're free, kind of like you're free after you have a good cry. Are the coping mechanisms that are available enough?
There's going to be plenty of people that we create that are going to be able to see that. Those that created them took that reality so lightly, that only wanted to put on the rose-tinted glasses and see the positives and speak from their addictions and their coping mechanisms, that they saw fit to then go ahead and create them. The suffering that we inflict on new sentient beings is completely unnecessary.
As someone who is not an antinatalist, you are arguing from the point of vanishment of something that already is. So the perspective is that although some people turn out to be happy, this is not guaranteed. So to procreate is a gamble with another person's suffering, and there is also an asymmetry between the good and bad. Do you think that it could be the case that we cannot look at this as like an arithmetical comparison? Okay, although there is more suffering than joy, ratio-wise speaking, that doesn't automatically mean it's better not to exist.
So what I want to say is,
Well, first, I think it would be smart for us to cover the definitions, which are kind of like the groundwork for discussion. There's quite a bit of variation between individual anti-natalists, because if you're active on Reddit, you're probably well aware of that. So, what is anti-natalism actually?
Yeah, as you said, antinatalism, anti-natalists, absolutely not a monolith. There's huge variation between different forms of antinatalism, different antinatalists. A proper dictionary definition: the belief that it is morally wrong to have children, or that people should be encouraged not to have children. That's now the definition of antinatalism. But antinatalism is an extremely old idea. Different antinatalists have all kinds of different opinions on things like where animals sort of situate in antinatalism, whether antinatalism only applies to human beings, so we would call that anthropocentric antinatalism, or if it applies to all of sentient creatures, so that we would call that sentiocentric antinatalism. Some antinatalists are very concerned with extinction. Others are not. Some antinatalists are concerned with activism. Others are not. There's all kinds of sort of fierce internal battles, because of these differences of opinion. As far as how I define antinatalism, I think that you could encapsulate antinatalism in its most basic expression as sort of a critique of procreation. Like if we are this umbrella of all different types of antinatalisms, I think something that all forms of anti-procreation are doing is critiquing procreation. So my second definition would be: antinatalism is a philosophical position and social movement concerned with ending suffering by preventing the birth, manufacturing, creation, manipulation, and existence of sentience or possible sentience. The way that I would define antinatalism would extend not only to human beings, but to all sentient creatures. It could also apply to the existence of sentience machines, or really anything that could evolve to have the ability to suffer or to be manipulated, even if it wasn't sentient. My antinatalism would be more of a statement against life itself. And again, some antinatalism beyond me extends towards that, and some does not.
Well, the good thing about starting with definitions is because I realized that a lot of the times when I start researching something without taking up the definition, when I finally see the definition, 90% of my questions disappear because they were based on misunderstanding on what the fuck we're actually talking about, right? And you also mentioned, okay, sentient beings. I believe that at some point, if we develop AI to a substantial level of development, it will also start suffering. So in that way, your perspective also includes artificial intelligence, basically.
Absolutely, it absolutely does. Yeah. So there's a whole kind of small but growing school of antinatalist thought called anti-AI natalism. There's been some academic literature regarding this because we might not fully even have the ability to understand the ways in which sentient machines suffer. It could be they could be experiencing forms of suffering that are sort of outside of our scope. There's also sort of the possibility that they could harm us.
Yeah. When you know how pain feels, you're able to inflict it better. Okay, so as I understand that, what you also mentioned, manipulation. If we want to significantly affect someone by our actions and it's not possible to gain their consent, then default should be to not take such action. And this is procreation, because it's impossible to take consent from someone who doesn't exist. We can only do it after they exist, but at that time they're already addicted to life and already attached. They're not objective anymore. So they will not give an objective answer. So no answer is like no. Um, and okay, so as far as the suffering goes, we're all aware that from the moment you come into being, you are affected by three kinds of frictions. So the number one is the physical suffering. The number two is discouragement. So that's a lack of will or bad mood or whatever. And then number three is aggressions from other humans or non-humans. So the prognosis is not good, right? Um, but we do have coping mechanisms. All our values, for example, don't arise from the structure of life itself, but they're introduced as a tool to these three kinds of friction. I think many people are religious because of the placebo effect, not because they would actually believe that anything will. So anyway, like a religious placebo effect. Actually, this is where I kind of hit the wall. I started questioning, are the coping mechanisms that are available enough, and are they readily available enough for the suffering? Because I think that you bring someone into being knowing that they're going to suffer, but then you say, oh, okay, but here are the tools for battling it. You know the suffering is going to come, so you do not need the tools if there is no suffering. Let's go back a little bit. Let's talk about you. So your story. I want to hear about your relationship with your parents. I don't want to turn this into a therapy session, but I'm interested in knowing where your perspective comes from.
Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Starting therapy can be hard. The right therapist for you may not be in your area. BetterHelp is now sponsoring this podcast. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. With BetterHelp, you can have your therapy session as a phone call, as a video chat, or even via messaging if you prefer that. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/Captainese. Clicking that link helps you support this channel, and it also gives you a 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. Again, go to betterhelp.com/Captainese. Clicking that link gives you 10% off your first month of therapy.
Yeah, so I was always a very strange kid. Genderqueer, and had just strange interests for a young child, really deeply in love with the character of Frankenstein. And Frankenstein sort of seemed to be saying something about procreation. There seemed to be some sort of commentary on the efficacy or the non-efficacy, the ethical violation of having created this new life. Maybe Dr. Frankenstein shouldn't have done that. Maybe we are all the modern Prometheus by, creating new lives. And then when I was in my mid-20s, I discovered people talking about the subject of anti-procreation on YouTube. There was this explosion of interest that I sort of witnessed happened. about antinatalism and all of these. YouTube was amazing at that time because it was sort of the response video years. If you wanted to engage in an active conversation with somebody else, there was a way of attaching a response video directly under somebody's video. And so there was all of these. Sometimes they went on for years, these conversations, these arguments, these debates on these topics from all different sides.
How do your parents or how does your family view our views? Do they share it?
So I apologize. I forgot all about that you asked that.
Yeah, no, me too. I just remembered like 2 seconds ago.
My father died around the time that I discovered all this, but we had been estranged for years before that. So he never really found out about any of this. I could not care less what his opinion on any of it would have been. It was a very reckless procreator, to be honest with you. I mean, two kids, abandoned both at totally different times of his life. So not impressed. But my mother's very supportive of, she would have loved to have had grandchildren. I think that it was a sadness that I was not going to go in that direction. But at the same time, she knows that this is a hugely important part of my life.
I actually just opened this conversation about antinatalism with my mother today, and she turned out to be very anti-natalistic. But it was so ironic because she told me all the ways that life is just suffering and it's better to not have ever been. Literally almost quoted the title of Benatar's book. And then at the end, she said, but I would like some grandchildren. Anyway, so I said, well, I mean, shit. Do we have an instinct to reproduce? And if so, why? Or is this just an instinct for pleasure? When it comes to humans, of course.
We desire sex. We desire pleasure. Having children is more of a social construct. It's more of something that's been developed by our collective cultures to want. We're the products of a DNA molecule. That's very easy to ascribe sort of a personality to it. I don't mean to do that. So if my language goes in that direction, it's just the limitations of the language. It doesn't want anything, but if it were to want something, if it could be described that way, it wants to replicate. And so we're sort of the meat suits that the DNA molecule is wearing. In order and sex is sort of this tool, this mechanism that it uses to perpetuate itself. So it makes us horny. It makes us in need of this thing that we have to seek out from the opposite sex. And it has no idea that we've, developed things like abortion and condoms and all these other lovely things that are constantly being threatened to taken away from us. Culturally, the desires that have been created culturally, especially in, well, I don't want to say especially in women, but I mean, these are very strong. I mean, to say that they're just a social construct or that they're culturally engineered or built, I can sound a bit flippant, like I'm saying, like it's no big deal, people can forget them. No, they're incredibly imbued in expectations other people have of us, expectations from our parents, expectations from society. These are not easy chains for people to break, but they are not a part, even though we are designed to have children, there's no actual mother instinct. All of that is something that we've sort of been fed and that's sort of maturated culturally.
Immanuel Kant's influential humanity principle says that one should always act in such a way that you never treat other people as means, but always as an end. So I think in this case, having children usually goes against it. Well, there are some exceptions to this principle that I disagree with in my grandiose self, like because in this principle, you're not allowed to tell a lie, even if telling the truth causes more harm in the short and long run. But I would say that procreation in this sense goes against this principle. And I also like what you said about us being like a meat coverage for DNA. I think that's okay. I agree. I think that when it comes to sex, and I think that if sex was not pleasurable, it would be so weird having it. You know what I mean? Like, it'd be like, what the fuck are we doing? So, and I think that even if, when it comes to sex, I think humans have additional layers of complexity in their sexual behavior. Because we have sex for pleasure. And well, dolphins are like that as well, and some snow monkeys, I think, or whatever the fuck, But anyway, so pleasure is one of these layers. It's serving as both like a biological reward system and as means of social bonding and individual satisfaction. So I guess you could say that nature figured out that we are too egotistic. So a simple instinct for reproduction won't cut it, because we'll eventually start questioning what's the purpose if there's nothing in it for me, right? So sexual activity serves other functions beyond reproduction for us because we're so complex. Um, do you think that, okay, so while it's an instinct for other animals, with humans, instinct is sex and pleasure, which is nature's trick for reproduction. But do you think that it ultimately supports something that nature wants? It's not about reproduction, but also kind of like a celebration of life. Do you think that there is like a positive force in universe? I mean, there has to be something. There has to be a reason why we have instinct for whatever. There has to be a reason why DNA has this instinct in the first place.
Well, DNA doesn't have an instinct. It's sort of like a computer program. It's basically mindless. It has a function. It's mechanical function. And that's sort of it. Why it exists, I don't know. I don't know what was the catalyst that sparked the existence of life, whether it was an accident of biology, whether it was just, it's this incredibly rare thing that happened to evolve on Earth. We know that. We don't really know the why. We just know that it causes a lot. I mean, there's some great things in life, but it also comes with this incredible unnecessary cost, which is this enormous amount of suffering for no real gain. So I don't believe that there's some force. I don't believe that there's any sort of yin yang in the universe that because there's all this bad, there's also all this good. There's no silver lining. There's no intelligent design. There's no gods. There's nothing out there in the universe that makes any of this justifiable. It's mechanical function for whatever reason it exists. We might never know that, but I think if we did, the truth would probably be fairly disappointing, in the sense that it's just some sort of chemical truth, not some sort of divine truth, in other words.
It's probably one of the toughest questions you can ask. Not just yourself, but also guests on your podcast. Why are we here? And it really made me wonder, when it comes to the emergence of life. Did it emerge out of what cosmic mistake? Like, is there actually a force in the universe that aims at something, and life is like a mutation? So now, as we started it, it's kind of like ongoing circle, like a mutation that keeps on going. And then also you could say that the aliens visiting our planet at some point would probably be more intelligent than we are, since it's them visiting us and not the other way around. But then again, they may never come because they may have reached this anti-natalism conclusion themselves. Where is everybody? Already wisened up and gone? You guys in the US have a debt that has grown to 1 trillion in the past 3 months, while your economy only grew by 5.5 trillion in the past 3 years. How's that one for you? I can offer you a degree of safety against inflation. You can now be less miserable about the prices, which seem to always rise more than expected, as the inflation just won't go away. Look, the government isn't going to take care of you, so forget the protests and do it yourself. Take matters into your own hands is what successful people do. I decided to help my audience shelter their assets and diversify them into gold, which is something that has always been used by the rich to preserve wealth throughout the history. Birch Gold Group makes the process straightforward. They can help you convert your existing IRA or a 401k account into a tax-advantaged physical gold IRA without any of the out-pocket costs. Just text Captainese to 989898 and receive their free info kit on gold IRAs that is packed with insider information on how gold and silver can protect your savings. I've checked out their references before partnering with them, and their endorsements include Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and Ron Paul, and I trust these people. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, Gold now has 5-star reviews and thousands of happy customers. Birch Gold Group is the nation's #1 gold IRA provider. To learn more, text Captainese to 989898 and claim your free info kit on gold IRAs. You also have the link in the description below.
What we do know is that when we create a new human being, we do it for reasons that cannot possibly benefit the being that we create. We do it completely without the suffering that we inflict on new sentient beings is completely unnecessary. There's nothing in the universe that it's feeding. There's nothing before a being exists, it's not in some sort of purgatory, dying to be born, dying to exist, wanting, needing. Want and need do not exist before procreation. We make sure that those things continue to exist, continue to be perpetuated, continue to be created by bringing new sentient beings into existence. And we do that for absolutely no good reason. It is a completely unnecessary act.
I think that when it comes to justifications with stopping, I think a lot of people mistaken vanishing from never having been. No one cares that there is no music on Mars. No one cares about that. As someone who is not an antinatalist, you're arguing from the point of vanishment of something that already is. And let me tell you, just from my perspective, it's very difficult to get out of that. And it's also very difficult to argue, to see other perspectives when you are already attached to the life that already there is. So the perspective is that although some people turn out to be happy, this is not guaranteed. So to procreate is a gamble with another person's suffering. And there is also an asymmetry between the good and bad. Do you think, okay, and I want to hear your take on that. Do you think that it could be the case that we cannot look at this as like an arithmetical comparison? Okay, there is more of that, so therefore this is bad. Do you think that it could be the case that although there is more suffering than joy, ratio-wise speaking, that doesn't automatically mean it's better not to exist?
Well, I think it's always better to take the fail safe. What is being gained by taking these kinds of risks? I mean, even if it's a small risk that the being you're going to create is going to die horribly of cancer, what are you gaining? And what is it that you can't derive from what is already here? What is it that you can't derive from your own existence? What actually necessitates playing those kinds of risks with a being that doesn't even exist yet, that may face all of these horrors? I can't see anything that could possibly justify.
Yeah, it's kind of like just because there is a shield available, why send a person to war? Okay, so you think there's not enough coping mechanisms and they're not readily available. Actually, you could argue that why cope with it in the first place?
Coping is for the living. So once we exist, let's have access to all the kinds of coping mechanisms that we possibly can. But I would also say that coping should also include things like the right to die. We shouldn't make people cope with existence. We should give them, if we're going to create them for absolutely no good goddamn reason, we should probably offer them a medically assisted way out anytime they want to. So there's no reason why people have to be forced to have a positive outlook and to cope and to do all of these. We sort of mandate that people feel better and get better and adjust and make do. And that's, in my opinion, an insane expectation. There's all kinds of, again, there's lots and lots and lots of things in life that I absolutely take huge pleasure in. Like I said, I'm an artist, I'm a toy collector. There's people in my life that I adore, all kinds of lovely things. And that it helps me get through my existence in style, but not everybody has those things. Life is not some sort of great equalizer. There's an enormous number of factors. It's sort of like throwing somebody out of a plane and then asking them if they like flying. That's sort of what procreation is.
Well, for me personally, with my coping mechanisms, which is my life purpose, my work, my relationships, And for some people it's also religion. I do like life, all in all, I think I made it. Like, I think I do enjoy it. And I really took advantage of these mechanisms. I will tell you what prevents me from being an antinatalist. And I think that it's great because throughout this conversation, we seem to know what we are talking about, which is not the case for most conversations. Um, so what prevents me from being one is because I I put a lot of emphasis. Now, there is an argument, do I put too much emphasis? But anyway, I put a lot of emphasis on our capacity to transcend the suffering. I mean, I basically just cited the terror management theory, but I think that we can have, I'm optimistic enough to believe that we can have a world where the tools are so readily available and the suffering is shortened by each and every generation. At the moment, I think each century we are wiser when it comes to alleviating suffering. And I think that there is less and less of it all. Um, and I think that, just how you say, you bring someone to the world and they're starving, but but they have the opportunity to hunt the food and they won't be starving. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm optimistic enough to believe that there is a world where we bring someone into the world and he's standing next to a full fridge.
Yeah,
And
I
it'll
don't
probably
share
take
that.
quite a while before that happens. Yeah, go ahead.
No, no, I interrupted you. I'm so sorry. I honestly thought you were done. For go on. Forgive me.
Actually, I was done, but let me go on. So I'm optimistic enough to believe that, all the suffering that the world has, I think that in time, well, because extinction is not just going to happen tomorrow, right? It's going to take a lot of time for us to actually extinct. And we can talk about that later, but I think that we might as well be using that time to put more effort into making a better world. I get this is the hedonistic imperative argument. I guess, to play the devil's advocate, if the environment is degrading due to overproduction and overconsumption, then the capitalistic response, which I'm a capitalist, would be, let's modify it so that we can produce and consume more. But anyway, but that's my perspective. I am optimistic enough to believe that we have that there's more into us than we believe, and if we really try and make a good society, then it's all in all, it's worth it.
When you're talking about your own life, you've made it. You know how to overcome your own suffering, and that's a beautiful thing. And I can say the same for myself, up to a point. I mean, not to be, we all die. I mean, there is some suffering that is absolutely insurmountable. But why the children that you may produce, the children that we produce, are not going to be us. They might not have any ability that we have to transcend the suffering. They might not like the fact that you've signed them up for terror management, theory classes. Why should they be obligated to be terrified in the first place? Why is and it's interesting that you bring up the idea of addiction, because that's a big piece of a kind of antinatalism called Atheism. Sort of identifying that that addiction is one of the primary sort of driving forces of life, and it's a big piece of what keeps us perpetuating life. That we like the taste of this thing. They may not thank you at all for having to go about this task of having positivity. There's plenty of people who are hungry that can't hunt. Again, my antinatalism is sentiocentric. I am also vegan. I don't like the obligation that maybe the only way that I could perpetuate my own existence is the consumption of an animal. Why should I be placed in a situation where my comfort, my survival has to come at the expense of another? There's all sorts of realities to living this life that require a feeding off of somebody else's sentient welfare. And there's going to be plenty of people that we create that are going to be able to see that and are going to, frankly, be appalled that those that created them took that reality so lightly, that only wanted to put on the rose-tinted glasses and see the positives and speak from their addictions and their coping mechanisms, so profoundly, so arrogantly, that they saw fit to then go ahead and create them, thinking that they were an extension of themselves, and capable or willing. The people of the future may not buy into the same narratives that you hold dear. They will be different people.
I think this is where the argument for extinction by suicide or whatever comes from. They seem it irrational assuming the new future being is better off continuing living because of the historical existence. So they see your future self as a new being essentially, and they think that the history is not enough to make sense to continue your suffering. Well, I assume that the argument against pro-mortalism from an anti-natalist perspective is the same as, well, you don't walk out of a movie theater just because you know the movie is going to end anyway. And then also, you are better off continuing living because you can make things better right now for people who are also in the suffering that you're in.
So in Better Never to Have Been, David Benatar's seminal 2006 work on antinatalism that kind of sparked this whole thing, pro-mortalism is defined as killing extinction. So if if antinatalism were to become the way of the world, there's two sort of paths that he lays out towards extinction. There's sort of the umbrella of phased extinction. So there would be it's a process, so there's killing extinction would be pro-mortalism, but then there's also a dying extinction, which would mean that it's a gradual process of, some people are born, but then less and less people are born, and then we just slowly go extinct. Killing extinction would be that, you could say maybe the benevolent world exploder, the big red button, would be a form of pro-mortalism. Interestingly enough, after that book came out, pro-mortalism started to not really generally apply towards conversations about extinction. And I don't know why that happened. It was a strange kind of shift. And then it started to be more about a conversation about suicide. And again, I don't know why exactly that happened. There's very few people that I know of that take the position that you mentioned of extinction happening through suicide. I have known people like that. There's a YouTuber by the name of Evil Blaze who I interviewed on my channel. He's died a number of years ago now. He didn't think that it was ethical for human beings to, as individuals, to draw another breath. He thought it was sort of an ethical obligation to kill oneself. I don't share that view.
I think it's a fraction of people, and I don't know, maybe I would even attribute it to some specific personality trait rather than a perspective. Actually, I might be wrong, but I wouldn't even say it's a perspective. It's a trait that just manifests itself into this type of thinking. Just as a living being, the fact that the body starts decaying as soon as you emerge from the day you become, and then you follow one-way path to deterioration and complete lights off, right, between some seconds and 100 years old. It's not a mantra I'd listen to as a self-motivation in the morning, but still I think that the average person, if you ask them, would you like me to help you end your life or cease to exist today? I think most people would say I'm good. And I think even people who are suffering, even people who have, I don't know, some sort of disease or last stage cancer or something, I think most people want to go on. So I think that, just this type of pro-mortalism, I think it's an extreme consequence of a trade.
Again, I think that there needs to be some kind of separation between pro-mortalism and the right to die here in this kind of conversation. So, pro-mortalism, just to be honest, it's a little bit of a mystery of how pro-mortalism as a separate entity manifests in regular people's lives. I don't know. I don't even know how it manifests we're getting into one of the most controversial sort of undecided areas of even how it fits into antinatalism.
By this time, you lost 50% of the audience anyway. So, it's like, you get like the longer, like the deeper into the rabbit hole you go, like the more shadow, dark personalities are listening to you. And then all of a sudden you're like, all right, all bets are off now. Let's discuss, people.
100%, 100%. No, but I mean, look, I think that people are sort of unspokenly obligated to have positive opinions of their lives, and people don't have access to the right to die. So the conversation around the right to die, I mean, if in most places, if you talk about the fact that you want to end your life, euthanasia is never an option that's given to you, even after years of voicing such a thing. It's pills and therapy and institutionalization, and you are constantly obligated to get better. So if people had, first off, an ability to actually evaluate, to actually write a product review of their lives, I think you would have a lot more honesty coming forth from people about how they really feel.
I think also you would, sorry to interrupt, but I think you would have less suicide by having that option open, because now a lot of the suicide comes from the pressure of believing that life is not supposed to be suffering. And I think that when you hold a different perspective, you have this feeling of, how you hit rock bottom and all of a sudden you're free, kind of like you're free after you have a good cry, right? So it's freedom and it's liberation from trying to force something upon a life that life is not supposed to be in the first place. So I think we would have less suicides than we do now.
Well, I think it would be great if people didn't commit suicide, but I think it would be great if people could have the option when they're ready. So I have no interest right now in killing myself, but what I would love is to have the option in my pocket for when I'm ready for it. Because there will come a time where there's a diagnosis, or where you know what I mean? Like, death ain't pretty. I don't know if you ever watched somebody die, but it's a horrible, horrific thing to have to endure. And there's absolutely, like creating somebody, there's absolutely no reason to put somebody through that.
I don't know how necessary it is for us really to delude ourselves with rose-colored glasses of our existence, and I really don't know. I'm not being cynical with this, because maybe we need them. The Pollyanna principle is actually just for the just for the audience. So it's a concept in psychology that refers to this human tendency to focus on the positive aspects of life and to remember positive experiences more readily than negative ones. So it consists of, I think, three biases. One is the memory bias, the second one is positive framing, and the third one is selective attention. So how we access our lives is more subjective than objective. But maybe we do need that. Maybe if you remove these rose-colored glasses, it's just not worth it. Like, just in terms of our integrity and solidarity to other people. You know what I mean? Maybe if you remove that, it's this hope goes away. Maybe the addiction is needed once you are on Earth, of course. Maybe, being realistic is not so beneficial once you're on there.
Well, I think people do need them, unfortunately. But I think our task is to be able to honestly recognize the fact that some people never have them on, some people cannot put them on, some people are unwilling to put them on. I'm not interested in taking off anybody's rose-tinted glasses. I want people to enjoy their lives. I hope people enjoy their lives. I hope people have lovely, wonderful lives. And I mean that absolutely, with absolute sincerity. But the fact of the matter is, when we create new people, we do not, people that are able to cope, people that are able to be happy, people that are able to have all this enjoyment out of life, is not a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought a bit.
This is where I think that, I'm way somewhere already. We're way out of my notes. Trust me, we're somewhere. This is why I said before that I think if we're really real with ourselves, we will see that we are religious because of the placebo effect. I think the less faith in God there is, the more urgent the question of anthropodicity becomes. I don't know if I actually pronounced that right, but antinatalism is then a consequence of the collapse of theodicy, as well as the failure to attempt to establish anthropodicity. So atheists become anti-natalist when they discovered that both of them are a no-go. So theodicy is an attempt to justify the existence of evil and suffering in a world that is governed by God. And then the anthropodicity focuses on justifying humans' existence and behavior. Basically, one defends God's goodness in the face of evil, while the other one explores the moral and existential challenges of human life. So I think this is where atheists become antinatalists, when they realize, oh shit, none of the two are sufficient enough for the arguments that I had before, for reproduction. Also, Benatar, I think that he said by creating a child, you are responsible for not only that child's suffering, but for the suffering for all future generations. So, assuming that a couple has 3 children over 10 years, that would be like 90,000 sufferers, if I'm correct. Although I don't really agree with that. I think that each generation is responsible for their own thing, just like the trauma work. If I have traumatic childhood experiences, that doesn't mean I can torment my partner, because my mother's trauma is the result of her mother's trauma, and then we go back to Adam and Eve. But I do see that per this theory, you could be leveraging your good deed, if you're an antinatalist, by alleviating suffering by not producing one child. So it's a leverage, because you're not producing one, and then you're alleviating the suffering of many, right? So you are like the cause of leveraging the alleviation of suffering. uh anyway, but before you said that that antinatalism has quite a history, isn't Buddhism antinatalist?
Well, so you brought up sort of two threads there. Let me just, if you don't mind, I'll address both of those really quick. I mean, so first of all, the wonderful Finnish bioethicist and philosopher Matti Haide and I recently wrote a book called Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. And we sort of talk about that similar argument in our idea of procreative self-corruption, that when we have children, it's not just that we've had a child, it's that we've continued a line of procreation, and somewhere down that line is probably going to be a suffering child, and that by buying into procreation, we have sort of corrupted ourselves. We have sort of taken on a element of wrongdoing. Not that it, people get kind of caught up in this, like, well, I don't want to feel guilty. It's not about being guilty or feeling guilt, but we have, in a sense, been the catalyst that creates a very bad life. And we liken that to the story of the ones who walked away from Omelas, which is this really a beautiful and horrible little story by Ursula K. Le Guin about this utopian town. And in the basement is this one suffering child. And that's sort of a very meaningful, I think, metaphor for procreation. That sort of like we keep creating new people. We may end up with this utopian town in which everybody is happy and everything is blissful, but underneath the surface, there's this child who is paying the price of all of this. And so for all of these happy lives, we may be corrupting ourselves essentially by causing these future children to pay the price for all of this happiness, and that's not a price worth inflicting on somebody else. But also coming back to the religious question. So yes, I've said this before in other interviews, so I apologize for repeating it, but there is, I think, a idea that antinatalism is kind of the last stop on the there is no God train. I get like things like we shouldn't eat other animals, we should allow people to have the right to die, we should not procreate. That follows from the ethics that could be derived from the idea that there is no Sky Daddy. But those that do have a religious perspective, antinatalism in world religions has a very long history. It's not a one-to-one same antinatalism as the antinatalism of David Benatar. I mean, we couldn't but there are far older iterations of the idea, but a very long history in Christianity. And we talk a lot about that in the book, and other people that have written about antinatalism have also written about that. The early Gnostics, the Gnostic Christians, had ideas very similar to contemporary antinatalism. And also there's passages in the Bible that, again, not a one-to-one comparison to contemporary antinatalism, but recognizable as a kind of antinatalist thinking. The Talmud also has passages, or at least one passage that I know of, very antinatalistic. And from what I've been told, yes, in Buddhism, Hinduism, there's quite a lot. There's tremendous amounts of scholarly material, I think, that still has not yet been written about those connections, but they have been pointed out by a lot of people, and I think that there's a lot of good work there to be done, furthering those investigations. Even though it seems like such a counterintuitive, obscure idea, it does seem to have this incredible power to be accessible to an incredibly large spectrum of diverse people coming from all different kinds of backgrounds, whether it be religious or non-religious. And that's interesting. It's interesting that antinatalism seems to have that kind of fluidity, that it can speak to people from an enormous number of different starting points.
It's funny because if Benatar's first book, Never to Have Been, was read by someone who hasn't come into existence, then his next book to read would be Buddhist Nirvana, right? Never to be again. And it's interesting because antinatalism has also something in common with Taoism, I think. I think that both view consciousness as a aberration of fluent universe that has stability and tranquility, right? So consciousness is something that cannot be fixed by just returning to a more harmonious way of life, but it has to be undone in order for the harmony to continue, right? So we're kind of running out of time, but just something I think something popped into my head. I think that the irony is that the more you hold the argument of decay and then disappearance as the ultimate argument for antinatalism, then the more you argue against this argument, the more antinatalism makes sense. So, to explain, the more solutions to antinatalism you find, the more you have to be in antinatalism. So, probably nobody understands what the fuck I just said. But for example, if we somehow find a cure that makes us live forever, the society becomes antinatalist by default, because then why keep producing people?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up. Well, first of all, the Taoism thing, there actually there is a paper by somebody named Robert Zendenberg, who I've had on the show, and he makes that same argument or similar argument, so that's very interesting. But also, I recently had on Aubrey de Grey, who is a biogerontologist who's interested in radical life extension. And I had him on the show recently to talk about sort of the confluence between antinatalism and immortality. And I mean, he doesn't and it is interesting that a lot of people, including myself, believe that there would sort of be no conflict between people having radical life extension or even immortality and antinatalism, because there's nothing. Again, I'm not that kind of pro-mortalist, right? Like, I'm fine with people remaining alive. I'll get extinction eventually, because it just is an inevitability. But yeah, that is a fascinating subject. That's sort of like just that intersectionality between immortality and extinctionist antinatalism. I would a point of difference between Aubrey and myself was that, like, I think that I would say yes to immortality, radical life extension in an antinatalist world, but the caveat, aside from people no longer having children, is that they should have access to euthanasia. And he seemed to disagree. He seemed to disagree because he thinks that if you give people immortality, you take away death, that they're going to be so happy that it's just going to remove all desire to end one's life. And I think that's not allowing people to have that access would actually make me say no to the whole thing. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, there is also a bit of a percentage of gamble in there, because you can never completely eliminate the chance of dying. There's still going to be accidents. Do you think that it would make sense to stop reproducing only when AI can take care of the elderly? And
That's an excellent question. Yeah.
right. Yeah, because extinction. Uh, sorry to interrupt. Because this extension, even if like the anti-natalism, all right, but at what point? Because we cannot just say, oh, like let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. That may cause more suffering to those already on Earth. I just don't know how it would definitely cause a lot of suffering. So we have suffering against suffering. So when you know what I mean?
Absolutely. So, an antinatalist world, let me just say the first off, an antinatalist world, it's not likely. But were it to be, if humanity decided this is going to be the future, you could not do it in some sort of sloppy, unthoughtful manner. It could not be nobody wants a Children of Men situation, right? The movie Children of Men, where like everybody just magically stops being able to procreate. You're talking about a horrific, slow death of humanity, tons and tons and tons of suffering, no solution for the animals. Nature goes on, perpetuating ad infinitum. Horror, just horror all around. So if, again, humanity decides that this is going to be the future, it has to be engineered in some kind of way. It has to be thoughtfully done. Now, David Benatar lays out the idea of phased extinction. That would mean that those that want to procreate could continue to do so, and it was sort of everything would have to be a gradual process of winding down the population again through allowing some birth, changing the culture around procreation, and how all of this kind of comes together, how all of it happens without creating a mess. I think that of the possible futures that people espouse and talk about and want, it is antinatalism that I think ultimately would cause the least amount of suffering, even if it went badly, which I hope that it would not. But that's not to say that it doesn't have the possibility of going badly. Like, again, I think how to do this effectively would have to be the largest human endeavor on Earth. It takes far more than a schmucky little artist, hanging out on Zoom in Chicago. It would have to be a massively thoughtfully engineered human project of how to gracefully end, as opposed to end in some sloppy, horrible manner. The objective of antinatalism, I think, should be how to end through as little suffering as possible. I don't think it can ever mean no suffering. I think that to end life probably necessitates. I think all futures, unfortunately, necessitate suffering. Unfortunately, including an antinatalist one. Whether that means just final generations being lonely, and you're absolutely right. That might mean that what we do is we do create machines that have some degree of sentience with some sort of self-destruct mechanism once we're all gone or something. I don't know. But AI that is somewhat sentient, perhaps a little dulled, or just good old-fashioned robots of some kind. Something that would allow humanity and the rest of sentience to go out with grace.
Well, here's another potential for sloppiness, because if we create an AI that becomes more intelligent than us, then maybe what if AI realizes that antinatalism makes sense before everyone on Earth realizes that? Then that could also be a problem.
Maybe the best outcome is for a sentient super machine becoming the ultimate negative utilitarian, and understanding that humans are sentience is suffering, and that would just end all of us. And there are some antinatalists that would view that idea with absolute horror And then there are those like me who think, well, no, that probably would be the best outcome, is that,
Well, the best case scenario, I mean, in a perfect world, what you would give to an extremely genius, intelligent AI machine is you would give them instructions, figure out the way to alleviate the suffering somehow by us still procreating. Choose the option, choose the better option. I think that would be anyway. Okay, so
there are antinatalists that are interested in that. There's David Pierce, who wants to, you might be familiar with. I mean, he wants to, radically re-engineer human beings to no longer feel suffering. And, if that was to occur, he thinks that procreation would somehow become ethical. He is an antinatalist, but he doesn't think extinctionism will win. So that's the path towards glory. I still think that procreation would be against consent. I still think that it would be a huge manipulation. I can't, it's hard for me to imagine beings that don't suffer, or that they still die. They're still prone to accidents. It's hard to imagine that wouldn't cause some sort of intellectual degradation of humanity. But yeah, so it's again, like we said at the beginning, antinatalism is no monolith. It comes in an enormous number of flavors, and when you really get into it, yeah, it's a fascinating subject that's with a lot of surprises.
oh, it's super fascinating, and I just tipped my toe in the water, so to speak, which is the whole reason why I can't seem to find arguments against antinatalism. As someone who is not an antinatalist, if I'm talking to someone who is an antinatalist, I'm not gonna put forward arguments if I don't have any. Like if I get a good counter argument to whatever argument I have, I'm going to go with the flow. Like I'm not, I have enough humility and enough openness, which a lot of people don't. I've seen a lot of people debating anti-natalists, putting forward arguments that made me question, that make me an anti-natalist. You know what I mean? I was like, this one, really? This one you chose. This one is so easily dismissed.
Absolutely. So, I am the host of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. You can find me on my YouTube channel. I'm about to hit 100 episodes by the end of the year, and yeah. I hope you enjoy the show if you get a chance to watch.
Thanks so much for coming on this podcast.